Well, hello, and thanks to all of you for joining us today from around the world. My name is Akriti Vasudeva, and I'm a research analyst at the Stimson Center and editor-at-large at South Asian Voices, which is our online policy platform for analysis on security, politics, and economics of the subcontinent. This is our fourth webinar in the past 6 months, How Time Flies. This is a series in which we examine significant developments in the region. And today, our discussion will revolve around how the outcome of the US elections may impact Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan. While consequential for the United States itself as the country deals with COVID-19 and racial division, the upcoming election is also likely to have significant implications for US global leadership, particularly in South Asia. Coming at a time when the intra-Afghan talks are in full swing, India and China are engaged in a months-long border standoff, and Pakistan appears to be moving closer to China and reinvigorating ties with Iran, Washington's engagement in the region remains crucial. What could a new administration mean for US presence in Afghanistan, security cooperation with India, and counterterrorism pressure on Pakistan? And how can the United States' great power competition with China and Russia impact the region? We'll get into all of this and more, and what a Trump or Biden victory means for bilateral relations and US policy in South Asia with our fantastic panel of scholars, all of whom are regular contributors to South Asian Voices. So let me take a minute to introduce all of them. We have with us today Sitara Noor, who is a senior research associate at the Center for Aerospace and Security Studies in Islamabad. Vivek Mishra, who is a research fellow at the Indian Council of World Affairs in New Delhi. And both of them were South Asian Voices visiting fellows last year. So thank you so much to Vivek and Sitara for joining us. And finally, we have Arash Yakin, who's worked in a variety of advisory, think tank, and other roles in Afghanistan for many years. And he's now studying in the United States, focusing on statecraft and national security affairs. Thank you all of us for joining us. I'm really excited that you're here. And I'll start by asking each of our panelists a few questions of my own, and we'll have a chat for about 45 minutes or so amongst ourselves. And then I'll open it up to the audience for a moderated Q&A for the remaining time. And we are collecting questions throughout this discussion. So if you have anything you want to ask our panelists, please put it into the Q&A box. And I'll try to get to as many questions as I can. And I'll ask our panelists to please keep their responses short so that we have time for follow-ups and a back and forth conversation. So let's start off very broadly, and I'll come to you first, Vivek. Give us a sense of what the landscape would look like for India and US-India relations, both if President Trump gets a second term or if Vice President Biden wins. And what are likely to be some convergences and divergences between US policy in South Asia at the moment and under the next administration?
Thank you, Akriti, for inviting me and for this wonderful opportunity to interact with a vast audience. I think if Trump comes into a second term, I think there's going to be a broader continuity in terms of policies across the spectrum of engagements of the two countries, India and the United States. Defense, I see government-to-government relations very strong right now, and that's going to continue. In terms of trade relations, I think the trade deal, which is still not materialized. I think the next administration in the U.S. will certainly try to push at least a smaller deal that they are trying to accomplish. So in terms of trade, also I see continuity and forward. In terms of strategic relationship, I see the graph going upwards only, because the Indo-Pacific, China has certainly intensified in certain ways the cooperation between the two countries. It has become, and gradually we see India coming out of this shell to name China as a reason why they're getting close to the US, or why at least it's legitimized the cooperation with the United States. So I see under Trump a broader continuity. If Biden comes into the Oval Office, I think there's going to be, again, a lot of continuity from this term, but to the extent the Democrats would want to project themselves as different in terms of policies vis-a-vis the Republicans, I think there could be a criticism of Kashmir, of issues related to Kashmir, which has come up in the past. But right now, Kashmir situation has completely eased up. Internet has been restored, mobility has been restored. So yeah, that remains an open question whether the Democrats would want to do that. But in terms of government-to-government relationship, I would also sense a certain cautiousness on the part of the BJP to engage with the Democrats initially. But I think the number of issues and the spectrum of engagement is so vibrant that I don't see much problems in either way. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. And we'll come back to this question more of how US relations with China and Russia will impact India-US relations. But let me come to you, Siddhara, and the same question to you. What is your perspective on how US Pakistan relations would look like either under a second Trump term or a Biden administration?
Thank you, Akriti, for the kind introduction and this opportunity. I think the current US elections are very important, not only for the American people themselves, but also for the United States, or redefining US role as the world leader, as you rightly pointed out in your introductory remarks as well. Having said that, I want to emphasize that most of the issues concerning Pakistan and the region at large would not have any major shift as a result of the elections, regardless of who comes to power, because there exists certain level of unanimity of views in both the Republicans and the Democrats, and most likely we are going to witness a continuity of the current policies in the next 4 years as well. Nonetheless, this transition offers an opportunity to Pakistan to build upon the convergences and work to reduce certain existing divergences and frictions, which are quite a few, I would say. And if you have to list down the convergences and divergences, I want to highlight that many erstwhile, and this is actually interesting in the Pakistan-US relationship, that many erstwhile divergences, when worked upon and seen from a different lens, have transformed into convergences. Case in point is Pakistan-US cooperation on Afghanistan, and the major concerns that US has had with regards to Pakistan's nuclear weapons safety and security. Developmental concerns remain the same, but safety and security concerns have largely been allied because of the close cooperation that had existed. And but it is very much likely that the current state of convergences will no more be there in future. Especially there is a risk that once the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is completed, the United States' interest in the region will be diminished, with or without the initiation of a genuine reconciliation process in Afghanistan. That's not only would be a problematic situation for Afghanistan, but Pakistan being the large, sharing a long border with Afghanistan would actually be affected by that. While both Trump and Biden have favored US withdrawal eventually from Afghanistan, the Trump administration, which has pledged a complete withdrawal, and the current today's tweet actually says that they want to complete the withdrawal by the Christmas this year. So there seems less likely to take in the post-withdrawal Afghanistan if Trump comes to the White House. On the contrary, Biden has announced a more measured policy by keeping some residual forces in Afghanistan And that actually refers to a continuity of a relationship and continuity of engagement between Pakistan and the US. That would actually be important for the sustenance of peace dividends that have been achieved so far. But a potential failure in maintaining lasting peace in country will be disastrous, as I stated, and that would, by whatever measures, I mean, intra-Afghan dialogue process that has initiated already, it's a very, very complex process. While Pakistan has played a role in bringing Taliban to the table, but Pakistan has quite significantly at a number of occasions have highlighted that there is a limitation to what Pakistan can do, and the rest, the responsibility lies on the intra-Afghan factions and the government. So one of the major enduring problem continues to be, in my view, when we look at how the state of affair has been between Pakistan and the US, that's the transactional nature of the relationship. And that plays out negatively in all other areas. So one divergence is the absence of common strategic objectives and mutual interest. US-Pakistan relationship has been based primarily on what happens, or for that matter, does not happen in the region and beyond. It is basically dependent on external factors rather than being based on the bilateral equation. We have had some good instances or close cooperation during Prime Minister Khan's last year visit, and their personal equation turned out to be favorable to Pakistan. But that was primarily, again, as I stated, because of the convergences that both states had developed over Afghan peace process. That was primarily the reason. So if quickly I have to list down 3 divergences, and I may come back to them in later discussion, 3 major divergences that I see are going to play heavily during the coming administration, whichever comes to power, would be Indo-U.S strategic partnership and the resultant preferential treatment, growing U.S.-China rivalry, and right now it's a bit dormant, but it's never dead issue. That's Pakistan's nuclear development. That's going to be a major area of discussion, in my view, with the next administration.
Thank you so much, Sudhara. And let me state at this point that this discussion is actually based on a South Asian Voices series on the US elections and impact on South Asia. So please make sure to check that out. We've shared that link in the chat as well. Arash, let me come to you now and ask you, what does it look like from Kabul's point of view in terms of the US role in Afghanistan going forward?
Thank you, Akriti, for inviting us and giving this opportunity for all of us to share our view. Let me start with an anecdote to say, when I was second, third grade, my father was in the period still in the communist government in Afghanistan, Najibullah, back in the 90s. And he, with his friends, always talking about Afghanistan, and they saying the situation is uncertain. وَزِيَادْنَا مَعْلُومَةً. Ironically, 3 decades later, today, when I speak with friends about Afghanistan, with America's friends and Afghans, other countries, we use the same word, is uncertain. Contrary to Pakistan and India, which has a policy, US government and a stable government over there is. In Afghanistan case, it's very complicated also because the Afghan government at this point, when we're talking, they're sitting in Doha about the future government, and depend what type of the government the outcome will be, if it will be the new government or not. You can have to imagine that if the Taliban somehow pursued the negotiators to create kind of autocratic government, it will be for the United States simply very difficult, whether it will be Biden or Trump, to support a kind of theocratic, another theocratic regime in Afghanistan. I think what also important is that from US perspective, this is the longest war. We've entered 19 years, and everyone is tired. I can say this from the US perspective, both Republican and Democrats, and they know that all medium that they had, from military to diplomatic, all actually failed. So right now is all hope is on the negotiation, what outcomes will be. And from that perspective, both candidates want to withdraw the troops. I think there's different between Trump and Biden to keep some part of the troops, some not. We all know that President Trump yesterday tweeted that he wants the all US military having here by Christmas. The question is, was this because we had also US presidential debate yesterday? Was this his internal message for his political, and the other question is also if that's really realizable, because sometimes President Trump wants something. The other question is if DoD can, and all term can accommodate his request. However, we know that President Trump's supported kind of the policy, the current policy to support the Taliban to get actually kind of de facto government, we can say. The Biden will be for him very difficult to, from his liberal perspective, to go on the table, negotiate with the Taliban. However, I think both of them know that troops must be gone, and at the same time, since American people wants troops get out of there. And at the same time, I think both of them want a peace process. Both of them believe it. The question will be what type of government Trump approve and what type of Biden team. Expecting is that the Trump probably let's probably care about that, what type of government is in terms of when it comes to the women's rights, when it comes to the minorities, when it comes to the religious groups. Probably Biden team will be dedicated to, let's say, human rights objective. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Arash. And I actually wanted to dig a bit deeper on what you were just saying. We know that Afghanistan is at an inflection point. It's the closest to peace it has been in decades. Earlier this year, we saw an agreement between the Taliban and the U.S. government that paved the way for U.S. troops to withdraw from Afghanistan. As you just said, talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban are ongoing. But judging by analysis in the Afghan media, and you yourself have argued this, that the Afghan government is seemingly stalling negotiations because they expect, Vice President Biden to win and to come into office and be harder on the Taliban. So my question is, what could a Biden administration do differently? And from Afghanistan's point of view, what would be the best and worst case scenario of US withdrawal? Arash, you're on mute.
Thank you. From Afghan perspective, it's the question is that if you see that from the Afghan government perspective or from the Afghan nation or that other parties, because it's not only the government who's making decision. And I think it's clear, let me also clear that Afghan government since like 7-8 years, such term as a government, as in one government not existed. I mean, the both elections ended on the fraud, and the both election somehow improvised governments which not cooperating with each other. Dr. Abdullah and Dr. Ghani, we saw in the last government, and today the same issue. Even they are not clear about what the strategy is about going with the Taliban in the negotiation table. So the Afghan government somehow, like 2-3 months ago, was with the idea that if Biden will win, probably he will less support the Taliban, and probably this negotiation will be stopped, and we can go forward from a power position, the Afghan government, with the Taliban on the table. I think meanwhile, both party, Dr. Abdullah, but also Dr. Ghani, cannot see through it, that actually doesn't really too much matter. I say it's matter on the economic terms and the political terms, how the US relation will be in the future within future Afghan government. But in short time, it's not like one person say, we want to keep military, we want to keep go as it was it. Both party wants to end it, military presence. So the situation is changing. That's why you see that the Afghan government try to postpone the prison release about 6 months. What's supposed to be done, and in 10 days by the March 10, it's took almost 6 months to release it. President Ghani improvised that Loy Jargah, which actually he never needed to approve to release the Taliban. And now they see it through it that the only way to have a government or to have a better future for Afghanistan is sitting on the table and negotiating. I don't believe that the Afghan government more hope on that idea that one will cut everything and the other go forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Arash. And Sidara, let me come to you now and pick up on what you last said about the risks and opportunities for Pakistan in terms of US policy in the region in the next few years. You argued that in terms of US policy in South Asia, such as US withdrawal from Afghanistan, India's role in the Indo-Pacific, and countering the rise of China, essentially, there will be continuity in US policy irrespective of who wins. But the question is, each of these do present a challenge for Pakistan, as you yourself said, and particularly stronger US-India security cooperation. And you also argue in your piece for South Asian Voices that Pakistan is likely to face more pressure on terrorism and nuclear issues after the US leaves Afghanistan, because presumably, Pakistan has less of a role to play then. So how is Pakistan preparing for this churn in the region and its relationship with the United States?
So I think all these problems take us back to the major issue that, in my view, is the lack of bilateral common strategic objectives. And in the absence of that, the divergences that I listed earlier, and you also pointed out now, would keep coming back. I think, the relationship has not developed independent of other states, be it Afghanistan, India, or China. And so this is one area where Pakistan and US need to focus for a long-term relationship on strong footing, but it has to be reciprocal, because there has to be the real sense of developing that bilateral relationship on both sides. So in the absence of that desired positivity, I think certainly focus is going to shift more on the divergences, particularly if the Biden administration, as I've highlighted earlier, comes to power. The nuclear program is likely to come under the close radar, primarily because, not only because the nuclear development or the nuclear non-proliferation is higher on the Democrats' agenda, unlike Trump, who had under whom global non-proliferation regime is already in disarray. Biden had particularly been critical of Pakistan's nuclear development. So this is one area where Pakistan may more pressure, and this is one area where more cooperative strategy would probably be required. And all this is happening in the backdrop of a growing Indo-U.S. strategic partnership with security and intelligence sharing agreements. And it is likely to make the situation graver. And on the other hand, there is this growing concern or growing sense in Islamabad that there is a general lack of appreciation of Pakistan's legitimate security concerns. There is this perception that the US was there was this US acquiescence and the tacit approval of Indian action that led to the Balakot strike, which basically tarnishes US image as a neutral third party. And that third party role, we like it or not, continues to be an important balancer in the absence of any bilateral risk reduction measures between the two countries. So the absolute tilt towards India will not only destabilize the regional balance, but also push Pakistan even more closer to China, which would eventually further polarize the regional divides. However, the recent statement from the hearing of the next US ambassador to Pakistan, William Todd, it is important to note, where he says that the Indo-US relationship would not develop at the expense of Pakistan. That's a positive sign and important signaling that, and one that provides basis from where we must start rebuilding our relationship with the next administration.
Thank you, Sudhara. And Vivek, I wanted to talk to you about the Russia factor in US-India relations. But before that, I wanted to ask if you wanted to respond to some of Sudhara's comments on the US-Pakistan-India relations and how they would look like under a new administration.
Yes. So I think there has been another statement by another senator which is contrary to what Sitara says. So we'll have to wait and see and how it really unfolds and which presidency comes to the helm. But in terms of broader relations, I think we've seen a slackening of the Trump's initial approach to Pakistan, and I think the relations, like Sitara said, has better over time between Pakistan and the United States. But I also understand the concern that the US-India relations have been will further intensify in the coming times because of China. And I think what impact that will have on Pakistan, because China-Pakistan relations have also improved and they will continue to improve because of the border clashes and overlapping claims of sovereignty between India and Pakistan and China. So I think that US is certainly going to play at least as some role in terms of how these dynamics play out. But coming to your question on Russia, I mean, if I can jump to that, or
yeah, I just wanted to make the point that we've seen that India's ties to Russia have been a major irritant in the US-India relationship, both because of legacy platforms of Russian origin that India has, or Indian purchase of S-400. So how do you assess this factor playing out in the new administration, as I asked, but particularly would a second Trump term see continued pressure on India, such as due to the CAATSA sanctions because of the S-400s, or will domestic consensus in the United States, as well as an alignment with India on China as the primary strategic challenge, cause the United States to grant Delhi a waiver? And what about, what happens under a Biden administration?
Yeah, thank you. Before I come to answering that question, I think I missed a part of the very first question, which was convergences and divergences. So I think under both the administration, I see a lot of convergences like China, Indo-Pacific, Quad, etc., to grow. But there's an interesting dynamics which I wouldn't call a divergence, but certainly a convergence in making, which is that the US presence in the Indian Ocean region is certainly going to increase. We have seen US on the verge of signing, or at least partly signed, the SOFA agreement with Sri Lanka. And it's ironical because Sri Lanka was at the helm in the 1970s to lead the Indian Ocean Zone of Peace movement, where there was a consensus in the Indian Ocean and countries came together, including India. India supported that foreign countries shouldn't come here. But due to China and many other reasons, but particularly China, and so we have seen India softening that stance. And also because of the logistic agreements, we're going to see the Andaman and Nicobar Island exchanges happening with the Diego Garcia perhaps in the future, and that is certainly in the. So these are not really convergences, but I see them as potential convergences under the next administration, either Trump or Biden. Coming to the Russia question, I think Russia is playing a very important role, particularly vis-a-vis the border clash between India and China. And it has been doing the back channels through the BRICS and the SCO meet. And if you see Russia's strategic behavior in the past 1 year, I would say, it has, from its initial obvious tilt towards Pakistan to signal to India, that has ended. That signaling has ended. And, for example, the S-400 supplies to China were stopped for whatever reason, but it was certainly stopped at a critical moment to signal to India that, okay, we also take your considerations into account. Then there was another statement by a Russian diplomat in New Delhi saying that arms to Pakistan will be stopped on India's request. This was, this is very strange compared to what Russia has been doing in the past, because they don't make their hedging strategy was pretty obvious, which is not so now. So given these concerns, I think under the next administration, under Trump, we're going to see, I don't see an intensification of sanctions pressure regarding CAATSA, but I would see a continuity of it. Under Biden, I see Biden, there is a dichotomy under Biden. There would be a dichotomy under Biden administration in a way that Biden has attacked Trump with Russia as the center. I mean, it is always, the attack is that he's been soft on Russia on various other issues. So how that will play out vis-a-vis India is an interesting question that remains open. So I don't see, and also because the Biden presidency wouldn't be as transactional, and pressure that if you don't do, they would say that if you have to buy card from the U.S. only, then I don't see those statements coming out of the Biden presidency. To that extent, I would assume that a potential Biden presidency would be softer vis-a-vis sanctions to India. I hope I've answered your question.
You did. Thank you, Vivek. And now, in the interest of truly having a conversation, I want to encourage our panelists to ask each other a question. Arash, I believe you have a question for Sitara, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. Many Afghans believe, and Afghan official too, that actually the war in Afghanistan failed against the Taliban because the United States never actually took any action against Pakistan, and Pakistan contributed to raise of the Taliban and safe haven providing for them, including for Osama bin Laden, Kuwait Shura, and everything. That is my question to you: is do you agree with the idea that the Americans sided more by Pakistan over Afghanistan, and what was the reason?
Thank you, Arash, for the question. I think such statements are actually an underestimation of Taliban's strength and an overestimation of Pakistan's power. Having said that, I think everyone has had their share of mistakes in the Afghan issue, and it's just time to move past that blame game. Pakistan never officially provided any assistance to Afghan Taliban, or just like Afghanistan never admitted to have provided shelter to TTP that has killed thousands of Pakistani civilians and military personnel. So, and also not to forget the original sinner in this entire crisis, who orchestrated the entire Mujahideen setup that actually has continued for that problem has built upon and has created problems for the entire region over the past 40 years. So there is a lot of grievances on each side, and very valid grievances, I would say, but Pakistan has admitted that there were mistakes and would not interfere in any internal matter in future. And has, with regards to the intra-Afghan dialogue, Pakistan has also time and again reiterated that there are no favorites. And I think, and I would refer to a recent visit of Dr. Abdullah to Pakistan, and where these debates did come up during one of the sessions that I attended as well. And I think all sides, including Pakistan's Foreign Minister and Dr. Abdullah, both were of the view that if we start blaming one another, there would be no moving forward. So everyone, as I stated earlier, has had their share of mistakes and troubles and grievances. And it's really the time to move past and help each other, because this is one opportunity. If we fail to grasp that, seize the moment, literally, this is something which is really important to transform into a broader security dynamic, a broader security that would actually help not only Afghanistan but greatly help Pakistan as well.
Thank you, Sudhara. And let's stay on the theme of Afghanistan. And Vivek, I believe you have a question for Arash. Vivek, you're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, so I wanted to ask Arash, what does it think about the U.S. China, the U.S. Afghanistan, China, India angle? So can the dwindling US presence in Afghanistan be seen as an accommodative process to create space for its other South Asian partners like India by the United States, primarily to maintain the favorable presence in Afghanistan, even in its absence when it withdraws. Of course, this assumes importance in the backdrop of increasing Chinese role in Afghan diplomacy and repeated, even public claims by the Trump administration on India to commit boots on ground in Afghanistan. So how do you see the dwindling US presence in Afghanistan in this dynamic?
Thank you, Vivek. United States indeed tried engage many countries within Afghanistan case, also to include also Iran even somehow to the case of Afghanistan. However, Chinese always try to not get engaged in the case of the Taliban. They offered somewhere to organize talks when the United States last year withdrew it from the direct talk with Taliban. But further is China is not engaged. China is also not strategic interested for them at this point to be in Afghanistan, like the deal that they have with Iran to get access to the Gulf, the deal that they have through the economic corridor with Pakistan, they have access to the Arabian Sea. Those are not the case in Afghanistan. Is the only biggest project what Chinese supposed to do was the copper mining, which actually never gone forward. So, however, Chinese have kind of regional view on they want, for them, any country that they can use it against India and then long term against United States, they want to invest. And Afghanistan for them is one of those, like say, cheap project, not need a lot invested. And at the same time, we have Wakhan corridor, which connect to the China. The Chinese are afraid of the Uyghur over there, which go to the province directly. For own security interest, China wants that having a stable region in that case. India is the same issue. India have tried always to not directly negotiate with the Taliban. We know India sees Taliban as a proxy war of Pakistan, let's say, in that term. And from that perspective, the United States tried to involve them, but so far they only supported the Afghan government side and never gone directly in negotiation with Taliban. How the future will play, definitely United States will try to keep Afghanistan on the India side to create kind of balance against Iran and Pakistan and China. But it's all depend also how strong the Afghan government is, the future government is. Are they able to keep neutrality, which I think for Afghanistan case probably should in no way using itself not a proxy against Iran, not proxy against Pakistan, not proxy against India. We more than anything need cooperation, regional cooperation in that area. So yeah, that's his view of it.
Can I add a sentence?
Sure, Vivek.
So I think that was well put. But what I also want to add here is that over the years, a practical aspect to dealing with Afghanistan has really come in Indian foreign policy, and I think that has been also because of Chinese involvement, and China is getting seats. China is getting seat at the highest level, and India is feeling left out. So over the past few meetings, we've seen India diluting its differentiation between good Taliban and bad Taliban. Eventually, we have become observers in the Taliban talks. So Ambassador from India, Ambassadors T.C. Raghavan, who is my current boss, and also Ambassador Amar Sinha, were sitting in the Taliban talks unofficially, like as observers. So yeah, that was my addition.
Thanks, Vivek. Very, very interesting, the additional detail. And Sitara, I believe you have a question for Vivek on China.
Yes. Yes, you partially referred to that question earlier, and Vivek did partially answer to that question. But broadly, what I wanted to ask was that in view of India's ongoing border clash with China and the existence of bipartisan anti-China sentiments in the U.S., would India be willing to openly side with the United States in confronting China in future? Or a change of administration would bring any difference to India's commitment to the United States, or plug in, plug out kind of strategy would continue to be India's future plan of action?
Yeah, thank you, Sitara, for that question. It's difficult to answer because of India's stance. One is, of course, the fact that for a long time, we've all believed, watchers of Indian foreign policy believed that what China does would define the extent of cooperation with the United States. And while that's largely true, I think the border standoff, the current border standoff, has truly proved to be an inflection point. So much of what has been discussed between the U.S. and India, particularly between Pompeo and Jaishankar over the whole 5 months of pandemic, has not come out. Let me tell you that. So they've been avowedly very, very frequently in touch vis-a-vis China. Then there was a White House statement, openly saying that if there was a military conflict, the U.S. would side with India. I don't know how far that would really translate into action, but the fact itself remains. It has proven in many ways and to be an inflection point. The arms sales to India were, India pressed for it, and some of them were procured during this crisis. So all of that really sinks into the fact that India is going to utilize this, the relationship with the United States vis-a-vis China. And if there was any time, I think this was it, because here is a government which really doesn't want to go back on its claims on sovereignty. Both China and India have brought out the MOFA, the MOFA of China, and the MEA of India have brought out statements on sovereignty claims contrary to each other, which means they won't go back, really, unless there is a hard sort of negotiation, and unless the winter is so harsh that really both sides decide to go back. But in terms of relations with Trump and Biden, I don't think that a Biden presidency would be. While domestically Biden has, of course, said that Trump has been soft in China because of his various statements that have come out vis-a-vis China in the pandemic. But that while China has become the point to attack Trump, I think because of the nature of Trump presidency of retaliating, Trump has claimed that he has done the maximum number of phone-ups in the South China Sea, etc. On these issues, I think the Biden presidency wouldn't be as tough on China. That's my guess, and that would be also what the Indian government would be taking into account. So, from that sense, I think because Trump's retaliatory nature in business or otherwise, vis-a-vis China, I think that suits India. So I think that calculation would be there. But again, like I said, India would be keeping its powder dry for Biden presidency.
So Vivek, let's just stay with that for a second on sort of India's hardening stance against China and how that plays into Indian calculations about its partnership with the US. What will be the priority areas of cooperation, particularly in the maritime domain, where we have seen India and China's strategic competition, and which has been the mainstay of US-India cooperation over the last few decades? So what types of actions would we see India engage in, particularly in the maritime domain, that we haven't seen before?
One obvious answer to that is increasing India still is trying and will be increasing its stakes on the other side of the Strait of Malacca. We've continuously seen India in the past few months, creating base for being able to do that. Be it the Chennai Vladivostok Connect, which actually passes through Strait of Malacca, goes through the Philippine Sea onwards to the Far East. So if that really materializes, India will have deeper stakes along with Russia in the Pacific. So I don't see the United States really opposing Indian stakes in the Pacific, even if it is with Russia, because it will primarily be for business and for commerce. The other issue is relations with Vietnam. I think India and Vietnam have been increasingly coming together, and I think the United States comes there peripherally. So one is, of course, the convergences on the other side of Strait of Malacca. On the western side, I mean, I see the southern Indian Ocean as being as potentially an area of convergence between the US and India strategically, because of China's increasing presence in the southern islands of the Indian Ocean. But along with it, I also see the US, other partners of the US, the transatlantic partners of the US, like the UK and France. France actually has a base there, Réunion. So I see cooperation in terms of corporate exercises, in terms of PASICs, growing in this area. So these, I think, would be some of the convergences that I can highlight in the coming precedent. And this I would say that this would cut across both presidencies, potential Biden or a Trump presidency.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we've seen that India has now completed logistics support agreements with all of its Quad partners. That's Australia, United States, and Japan. So that actually increases interoperability in the Indo-Pacific. I want to come to audience questions very, very quickly. So if you have anything you want to ask the panelists, please put it into the Q&A box. But taking this question of US-China great power competition or tensions and how that impacts countries in the region, we already spoke about, India, China, US. But so then I wanted to ask you about Pakistan. We've seen obviously that Pakistan and China have had a very important strategic relationship for decades, but Pakistan and the US have also been allies. So how do US-China tensions actually impact Pakistan? Does it put Islamabad in a difficult position to choose between these two countries, or has that debate already been settled? Because in the past few years, we've seen that Pakistan has gotten much closer to China and is treating it as sort of a primary strategic partner. So what would you say about this sort of dynamic?
As a result of this growing tension, definitely it's a very difficult situation for Pakistan. But I think the debate is far from being settled if it comes down to choosing between the two, because Pakistan certainly attaches highest importance to its relationship with China because of its massive investment in the country through CPEC and other very important defense cooperation. But Pakistan certainly does not want to become sort of a victim of crossfire between US and China or to play one against the other. On the growing US-China rivalry and the so-called rise of China, Pakistan understands that the concern in the US is largely bipartisan. Although Democrats initially, when the first phase of CPEC was started during the Democrats' period in the US, they were not against CPEC per se, and the critical statements have started to surface only in the past couple of years under the Trump administration. But it is important to note that the criticism on CPEC is not on the economic development per se, but it's more on the methodology, what US terms as the lack of transparency and its potential security implications. While the criticism is going to grow in the future, the situation, in my view, still has not reached at a point where Pakistan have to pick sides once and for all. And this is also probably because Chinese are not expecting or pushing Pakistan to severe relationship with the Americans. Therefore, side by side, CPEC Pakistan should continue, and this is what I'm talking about with regards to talking to a number of people, should continue to work closely with the United States on broad-based areas and just not the security. And Pakistan should offer its services in bridging the trust deficit between US and China. Although realistically speaking, situation is way different from the 1970s when Pakistan did that earlier, and expecting a replay of that would be naive to say the least. But certainly, any sort of connectivity in such tense environment would be desirable not only by China, but also by the United States. And Pakistan can certainly be that bridge.
Thank you, Satara. And Arash, let me ask you as well, and we discussed this a little bit already in terms of China's role in Afghanistan, but we've seen that China has made massive economic investments in Afghanistan in the last few years, and obviously has a large diplomatic role to play now, including in terms of talks with the Taliban. So what do you see the role of China in a post-withdrawal Afghanistan after the US troops leave? What do you see China's role as being? And you expect that US-China great power competition would spill over into Afghanistan, as some people argue it already has?
Yeah, I think people are right. Afghanistan is from term of economic perspective is not really interesting partner for the China. Could be Miss INAC or mining. Cooper could be one of the projects, but further is it's not a big strategic location in terms of getting access to it. We are a strategic position in terms of to get to Central Asia, but at that point, China has not the priority. Focus priorities is mostly in Iran and Pakistan, and actually more getting access to the sea than going back north to Central Asia. China is, and in general, have been always good in Afghanistan, and it's also important to say that China has not any background within Afghanistan, and that's also kind of fine of that. They can use that. The Soviet cannot use that. The Soviet was involved in Afghanistan. So they have already a kind of clash with an Afghan society and with the Afghan government and everyone. Same Americans has a kind of conflict in the last 20 years, maybe about the last 4 decades, let's say. Chinese has a kind of clean background in that case. So for them, is it definitely will be regional cooperation for them will be priority to create kind of, they're already trying to create conversation between Pakistan and Afghanistan, Afghanistan and Iran. They're trying to get Afghanistan on their side. However, there's also Russia, which important to say because the 3 satellite countries has a border with sharing with Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is still for Russia is kind of backyards in terms of strategic security interest. And although Russia is not right now not what the biggest, let's say it's comparable with China and the United States. However, there's still a party who has something to say over there, and in long term, also Russia wants to keep Afghanistan neutral, as always tried historically to try to keep it, to have an access to that area.
Thank you so much, Arash. And we're already getting some very interesting audience questions, so I want to get to that quickly. But before I do, I wanted to ask my last question to all of the panelists. If you had to advise a new administration on what their priorities in South Asia should be, what would you say? And if you'd like, you can answer this specific to your country. Should we start with Siddharth?
So definitely, as I stated, that despite the fact that continuity shall remain in most of the policy, this is a time to reassess and have some new expectations. So in my view, the new administration should not view the relationship in a zero-sum manner. The region is actually very complex. Pakistan is surrounded by 4 countries, and US is very heavily invested and interested in all 4 of them. That is India, China, Afghanistan, and Iran. Out of 4, 3 are problem areas for the US, with one exception, India, which is a problem area for Pakistan. So when we look at the hearing of the ambassador designate to Pakistan, we see priority list comprising of Afghanistan, India, terrorism, and nuclear issues. But an important element that is missing out of this stated objective or stated agenda is, that is bilateral trade and economic relationship. This is an important area that will not only strengthen the bilateral relationship, but would also broaden the nature of relationship. And I think that should be the priority for the next administration. One important step could be, which I have referred to during the piece that I contributed earlier, could be the revival of an official strategic dialogue between Pakistan and the United States. And that would be a broad encompassing areas covering diverse fields such as trade, economics, terrorism issues, defense and security. And I think now is the time where they should establish a mechanism, and that should outlive the temporary convergence that we have over Afghanistan right now. But this, first of all, it requires, as I stated earlier, an honest and genuine appreciation of Pakistan's security concerns vis-a-vis India, and vice versa, because Pakistan understands what US concerns are in the Asia-Pacific and why India gets preferences in a way. But it's important to have that genuine understanding or appreciation of Pakistan's security concern and strengthen the relationship on a broad-based manner, not only through the security prism or not only through the external security lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Sitara. Very comprehensive. Vivek, let's come to you next.
Yeah, thank you. I think on a broader level, not just South Asia, if a Biden presidency comes, we should see some of the, some of the restoration of the pullout of institutions that the US under Trump has done, for example, climate change, also TPP. That might not directly affect South Asia, but a broader policy perspective. Second is vis-a-vis specific to India, I would say a Biden presidency could be more lenient on the visa issue. And I think that is something that that India would be looking forward to. But even a second Trump presidency, I don't see that easing off. The third is the trade deal. I think the United States, whichever president comes into power, should actually assess the impact of the trade deal that they are actually asking for on the Indian farmers. I think that, and that is one of the reasons why India has sort of put its foot down and is not going ahead with what the US wants here. And the last thing I would say, in terms of broader Indo-Pacific policy, the 2+2 strengthening of the 2+2 mechanisms and Quad, etc. I think BECA should come forth. Whichever presidency comes through, I think it's just on the verge of. We've been listening and we've been discussing it since last year. But I think it's just on the verge, and it has lost some focus because of the United States' own internal dynamics and approaching the election cycle. But I think whichever presidency comes through, BECA should come through, and that will sort of consolidate the whole three fundamental agreements to collaborate on information exchange more strongly. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Vivek. Arash, last to you on what you think should be priorities for a US administration in Afghanistan.
I will say also start with to say that the United States have actually in the last 4-5 decades always kind of choose one pillar in the region and use that one against others. Use it Iran, then move it to Pakistan, use it against Afghanistan, and now is moving actually to India and leaving all others. It's a kind of one pillar policy, which actually resulted that the United States not only lost the region to China, but helped it back Soviet, the Russians is come back. Iran become one of the most influential, let's say, adversary in the region for the United States. So United States have to move away from that idea from creating one pillar, which right now is India. Not that I have against something against India, but that the history shows that actually it's a wrong policy. We Henry Kissinger helped it. We created China, and ironically, we are today dealing with China as the biggest adversary to us. because exactly the idea was that we created only one and supporting them. I'm also worried in that term of using India and United States using the strategic relation is that purely at this point is on a military corporation. That's also important to say that mostly is in the US there's a less assistance available with the Trump administration, more on the foreign military sales. So weaponing already the region, which already messed up, I may say, it's not going to help on the corporation, but also for the American interest. In Afghanistan specific, I think Americans, some people say it's 20 years with Afghanistan, 19 years. It's not true. United States is almost 4 decades with Afghanistan is involved. From 79 until now, we are involved. We got Americans give it blood on an Afghan war, trillions of dollars, and that will be wasted to go forward with any demands that the Taliban has it. But at the same time also to go forward with a corrupt government or an Afghan government, which is important to say also from an Afghan perspective, that the fact that we ended where we today are and where the Taliban becomes so powerful is the corruption within Afghan government. It is not unity of the policy. So we have to end with giving a blank check to a government which we already know that isn't corrupt, or replace them with actually with Taliban that we know who they are. That the Taliban it's not changed it. It's actually becoming violent. If you go back to 1995 when the Taliban came, the fight was fighting against Mujahideen and here there against population, but it was not to come with a bomb car in the middle of the Kabul and kill 400 people in daylight. This is the worst scenario for international order to support such government. So I think who win the election have to have a kind of regional approach, but also an American has a leverage. I think we're not using him. We have a political power, we have military power, and we have financial power. Last time Dr. Ghani wants to create his own government after the fraud election, and American told him that we're going to cut $1 billion or you will create a cooperation with Abdullah. So it's worked. So we have that power also in financial term to support a government which not creating a risk for the own nation, but also for the region at all.
Thank you so much, Arash. So now let's get to audience questions, and we have some very interesting ones, and I'll call on each of you, the panelists, depending on the question. I'll probably combine a few as well because we've got a lot of them and some of them are related. So Sitara, let me come to you first, and this is an interesting question on U.S.-China-Pakistan relations, and I'll read it verbatim. It says, what kind of U.S. engagement would be needed for the Pakistani army or military to tilt away from China? Is it merely a question of infrastructure and investments, or could the US somehow bring about a change in the Pakistani adversarial stance towards India?
Thank you, Akriti, for explaining the question, reading the question out. I think it's not about what Pakistan military establishment or the political establishment wants from the US, or US have to do something to move them away from the Chinese tilt towards China. I think it's more of a US disengagement that pushes Pakistan more further towards China, because Pakistan, and for that matter, even China, does not really want a Pakistan totally dependent on that. On the Chinese side, there is no restriction per se that we develop our relationship with the United States, and there is a great desire. There is nothing on the American part that they need to push Pakistan away from China, but it's only opening the door for China to have more broad-based relationship with the United States that I referred to earlier, that there is a great desire in Pakistan already. And it's just not about the infrastructure. As I stated, Pakistan attaches a very, very high importance to its strategic partnership to the Chinese, primarily because China is the only country who is investing a lot in Pakistan and who is providing defense assistance to Pakistan. That's the only country where Pakistan can actually go, and there are a number of things that they are doing jointly. So it's not that Pakistan wishes to tilt heavily in favor of China. As I stated, Pakistan even now, if given a chance, can play a bridge, and there is this sentiment very widely prevailing within Pakistan security as well as the political establishment that Pakistan can and certainly should serve as a bridge between the growing hostility between between China and the US.
Thank you, Sitara. Vivek, the next set of questions is for you, and I'll combine a few that we received from Paul Sullivan, Amna Walistan, and Ankit Bhuptani. So one set of questions is about Senator Kamala Harris and her background and her understanding of India and how that will impact US-India relations. Also, some of her past comments on Kashmir and will that be an issue in terms of human rights, etc. Also, will there be a change in US support for India's UNSC seat if there is a change in the administration?
Thank you for that question. I don't think, let me start in the reverse order. I don't think there will be a change in the UNSC stance of the United States. I don't see that changing at all, whether Trump administration or the Democrat presidential candidate Biden, because one set of reasons is, of course, it concerns China, but the larger issue is, of course, India-U.S. relations, which has preceded the current China crisis. So I think that is going to hold. In terms of the nomination of Kamala Harris, I'd written it in my piece for SAV that I don't think in the current BJP government in New Delhi is basically has shied away from saying anything, has deliberately said that we will not take a stand or will not comment on the nomination of a vice presidential candidate of Indian descent, partial Indian descent. So I think they're, and they claimed that it would be an intervention in the US election cycle. I don't think that is the real reason. The real reason is that they really want to wait and watch and how this plays out. But coming to the Kashmir question, I think the Democrats have in their campaigns, both Kamala Harris and Biden have commented on the Kashmir issue. But I think if you see the chronology of their campaign statements leading up to the cycle, it has been moderated by themselves. I mean, they've claimed that India is a priority. So while they seem like self-contradictory statements coming from the Democrat stable, but I think that has been deliberate. Their statements have been moderated. They have emphasized that India is a priority, etc. And even as also you have to see the chronology in India, like the Kashmir situation has over the months east. I mean, it is not a problem anymore here. But again, some of the concerns remain on why the decision was taken and what the impact it had. And this also links with the current crisis of China. China has claimed, although there's various reasons, but one of the reasons that has been attributed is that India's decision to change the Article 370 of their constitution to change the status of Jammu and Kashmir. So I don't see if a Biden presidency really comes into power, we could see still a few statements on Kashmir in retrospect on why the decision was taken, but I don't see that contradicting the United States stance on helping India or partnering India against China. I don't see that. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. And I'll just add that President Obama, when he was a candidate as well, was fairly critical of India's Kashmir policy, and then came into office and moderated a lot of that stance. So there has been, we've witnessed that before as well. So now we have a question. It's very interesting, and I'll ask for all of the panelists to respond to this. And this is again from Paul Sullivan, and he asks, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he's essentially saying that the same way that the United States has multiple interests in South Asia, the countries in the region will have many perspectives on what these interests are. So how clear are these two leaders and political leaders in the region? And I'll just add to that in terms of how much of a consensus is there in each of the countries, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, towards developing stronger relations with the U.S. Should we start with Arash?
Afghanistan the last 20 years fully depended on the international help, and majority of that budget comes from the United States. Even with the next few months, if the new Geneva conference will not going to help Afghanistan, the government will be crashing. So Afghanistan need the United States in terms of also financially, let's say. However, the last 20 years, and comparing to what Afghan themselves tried to create a good relation with the United States, and the Afghan leaders always try to play own game. And we saw that President Karzai going with deal creating with Iran, and going visit with Soviets, with Moscow. Same thing with President Ashraf Ghani, you see it. He kind of using nationalistic rhetoric against American, and that's probably definitely contributed also to the current situation. I mean, there's no secret that the situation between Ashraf Ghani and his inner circle is the worst with the United States. I have to say it's ironical, because most of them, including Ashraf Ghani, is a U.S. citizen. All the diaspora ministers over there, they are somehow engaged with the U.S. But however, politics, we know, power, and they're trying to keep it and don't give the power to the Taliban. So from Afghan perspective, definitely there's a idea to try to create sea also around, sea to the Russia, sea to the Chinese, sea to the US, to not count only on the US. The same way as I say at the beginning, that Americans are tired from the Afghans. Somehow also Afghans tired from Americans, or dependency. So definitely they're looking around to create a kind of other corporation. At the same time, it's very clear that the financial position of the government is very weak. And the Taliban at this point have actually, ironically, better relation within the United States negotiating team than the Afghan government. So let's say that the new government will be created, temporary government, and Taliban playing their big role. Definitely that will means that we will have again a strong relation with the United States. So yeah, it's everything is depends also who win on this side and what happened out there.
Let's go to Vivek next.
Thank you. I think that was a fascinating question by Paul. So I would like there are two approaches to look at it. One is of
Vivek, I think we lost you. So
am I audible?
yes, you are now. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I think there are two ways of looking at it. One is, of course, at the regional level, at the broader regional level. The other is individual countries' consensus on the US presence in this region. Again, the example that I gave fits into the regional perspective earlier, which was the Indian Ocean zone of peace. Most of the South Asian countries back in the 70s were not in favor of the US presence in the region for a reason, because of course it was the peak of the Cold War. Countries didn't want to get dragged into it, etc. But over the years, as you've seen after the 90s, end of the 90s, unipolarity gives way to multipolarity. And now what Jaishankar often refers to as multi-alignment. I think the United States has fit itself into that role, and the South Asian countries completely understand that. And so there has been a gradual moderation of stance on what the US presence means in this region. It's not a direct threat to most of the countries, and therefore there has been a broader consensus on the US presence in the region. I mean, look at in September, the United States signed a defense agreement with Maldives, and India welcomed it. Had it, it's unimaginable that something of this nature would have happened during the Cold War. So I think that really, that is one concern. The second is increasing sovereignty of states has given rise to individual decision makings of the state. And I think each country, small or big, respects, in South Asia at least, their own decisions to take, their own prerogative to take decisions. And I think that has also helped the United States fit into this region and moderate its role. Coming to India, I think we've seen since the 90s, there has been multiple agreements, the changing nature of strategic partnerships, etc., has really created a bulk of a consensus or a bulk of convergences, from which going back is really difficult. And a conflict with China certainly intensifies that nature of cooperation. So overall, I think in India, there is a broader consensus of the nature of US presence that is currently here. In fact, it's only going to intensify from here. Although we voted vis-a-vis the Diego Garcia, we voted against the United States, but that's for a different reason in the UN. But I think broadly, we still look to cooperate with our logistic agreements with the United States presence at Diego Garcia and other places. So I think that broader consensus holds. Thank you.
Thanks, Vivek. Increasing alignment with the United States, but still a policy of strategic autonomy on certain issues. Sitara, same question to you on Pakistan.
Thank you, Akriti. If I'm reading the question correctly, it talks about varying perspective in the US and how the thought leaders in the country or the region are looking at it. I think as far as Pakistan is concerned, there is this realization that as I stated earlier as well, that broadly there is a bipartisan approach in many of the issues concerning Pakistan, and that is going to continue to be the same. Talking about a different perspective, I think at strategic level, more or less there is a sense of unanimity, but I think the approach might differ and how different sections within the United States actually look at different issues. I mean, interestingly, there is this perception in Pakistan that some of the issues or how Pakistan is being viewed is different by the State Department, and it is different how the DOD views Pakistan, depending upon the nature of relationship. So that divisions or different perspectives by different sections of the US administration are well in the consideration. And these are, I'm talking about the strategic objectives and the tactical nature of the things which actually translate into those strategic perspectives, I think is how Pakistan is being viewed by the larger American public. And in that area, I think Pakistan needs a major facelift because Pakistan is misunderstood in a number of ways. There are a number of things which Pakistan thinks it has done for the strengthening of American objectives, but they are not really well perceived the way Pakistan thinks they should be perceived. So that add to the grievances and adds to the layers of relationship that I talked about and creates actually certain problems in those layers, mainly because of there are perceptional issues. There are varying perspective in the different sections of society, not only in the US, but also in the Pakistan as well. But I think that's an important area where effort needs to be put in, not only by the United States, but also by the Pakistan. And I think in that regard, one major challenge that Pakistan faces is with regards to different lobbies that work in the United States. And when it comes to Pakistan, Pakistan not only has to compete with the Indian lobby, but it's also there is anti-China lobby that purely sees Pakistan in the Chinese camp and does not see it as an individual country. There are, I mean, in that way, there are multiple areas where Pakistan need to focus on to change that perceptional or perspective in different thought, different interest in the US.
Thank you, Sitara. I think this will be my last question to all the panelists. It's an interesting one. And this is from Sophia L. And she asks, does each country have a preference between Trump or Biden, and why? Let's start with Vivek.
Thank you. If you read my SAV piece, India, even if it has a preference, doesn't want to show a preference. And I think that's a very, that's a stance that you can link with the strategic autonomy as referred by Akriti, or the possibility, or the foreign policy itself of India, which is not tilted towards one set of Democrats or Republicans, or the overall relations with the United States of India is such that it doesn't really matter which president comes into power. I think it can work equally well with both the partners, and I think that is why there hasn't been any political reaction to the naming of candidates. There hasn't been a public acknowledgement, except for the Modi-Trump. When Trump visited India, there was a public show of support to Modi. But apart from that, I don't see, as we've moved closer to the election cycle, I think why? I think because of India's own policies, to be able to effectively work with both the candidates. It has a slight preference, I would say, this time towards Trump, but that's completely latent, and that is my view. So, yeah. Thank you.
Let's go to Sitara next.
Yeah, like Vivek said that in terms of preferences, I don't think Pakistan actually has shown any preferences, but broadly speaking, Pakistan has been more comfortable in dealing with the Democrats, but primarily probably that's not something to do with the Democrats per se, but more of the kind of situation we find ourselves in. But I think there is that has been largely the case, and Pakistani diaspora community has also been largely supportive of the Democratic candidates, largely speaking. But I think in terms of preferences, some of the statements that has come from the Biden and the Kamala Harris with regards to Kashmir and human rights violation in India, that were well received in Pakistan. But as I've mentioned in my article, as well as Vivek also rightly pointed out, that over the time they have toned down and they have become more measured. And I personally do not really see there would be a really drastic change in terms of America's policy towards India if Biden administration comes into power. So yeah, fingers crossed. I hope the election process goes smoothly and we really see a smooth transition. But having said that, I think Pakistan would actually be looking forward to, as I said, this is an opportunity where not only new U.S. elections are coming, but Afghanistan situation is at the crossroads. So this technically offers an opportunity to reset or reinvigorate the relationship with whatever administration comes forward. And I think Pakistan administration is looking forward to that.
Last word to you, Arash.
Thank you. I have to say, Trump started very well in Afghanistan when he came here in the power. And probably the reason was his kind of anti-Pakistan maneuver was very, very welcome in Afghanistan. It's unfortunately the reality that the relation between two countries historically have been based on the hostility. So Trump was welcomed with that regards, but halfway now the Trump administration with Ambassador Khalilzad created peace talks, and it's definitely letting the Afghan government release 5,000 Talibans. It's very, very bad image in Afghanistan over the U.S. government, over the U.S. policy, because you know that this was not the choice of Afghan government to release the 5,000 Taliban, but it was pressure from Americans. Also, you have to see that the majority people who somehow interested in the foreign affairs and the politics and highly educated somehow benefited from the 20 years American presence in Afghanistan. They are very, very connected as from employee, from a taxi driver to the for an NGO working over there, to the cook somewhere working, to the security guard, to the project manager, all of them somehow connected with the US involvement. And they see this as kind of selling them now at the last moment to the Taliban. This created kind of very, very anti-Trump perspective in Afghanistan, which from that perspective, I can also understand. There's a more eyes to Biden. However, Biden also have been few times where we saw the last interview over him when he was asked did he has any feeling for the Afghan woman, for Afghanistan, and he responded that he don't see any responsibility of the United States. So in general, I think as our other panelists say, the diaspora community is mostly on the Democrat side, but an Afghanistan government is right now prefer Biden, kind of with a hope that he will change the current course. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a really interesting discussion, and I think our panelists are pretty much in agreement that there's likely to be a lot of continuity between US policy in South Asia at the moment and in the next administration, irrespective of whoever wins, whether in terms of US withdrawal from Afghanistan or a greater strategic alignment between India and the United States, especially as the threat from China looms. But our panelists are asking the new administration to prioritize having common strategic objectives between Pakistan and the United States, need to develop relations that are independent of other countries. Similarly, with regard to Afghanistan, not using one country against another and having more of a regional approach and using American leverage correctly in terms of putting pressure on the Taliban, and more India and United States maritime security cooperation. So with that, we come to the end of this panel, but you can continue this conversation with our panelists as well as our other contributors on South Asian Voices, where the video of this discussion will be posted, as well as the essays that I mentioned earlier on which the panel is based. So please do check those out and follow us on Twitter at SA Voices. And I want to thank Sitara, Vivek, and Rash very much for joining us today, as well as all of you. And we'll see you again very soon for the next SAV webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.